Hello, marvelous muffins. A long time ago, many eons ago, I was a preteen, a 13-year-old, and like any 13-year-old, I went to a store and bought a katana. Uh, because that's what people do, right? Anyway, so I've had this since I was 13 years old, and my friends currently come over and swing it around a whole bunch, so I decided that since they enjoy doing that so much, I would graciously make them an actual handle. As you just saw, I removed all the layers of tape from the handle, and now it was time to actually start making this thing better. So, in order to do that, I first began by cutting some paddock, as you can clearly see in this footage of my shoulder. Initially, my thought was to take two pieces of paddock and then put them together, and then router them into the curved shape that I'm trying to make, and then layer strips of cherry and purple heart on top of those pieces. Problem is, they all basically became misaligned, and that approach did not work. For my next approach, I began by cutting out another jig, and I will just allow my old self to explain what I was trying to do here. This will be the core of the sword handle. That's kind of the idea. And I will attempt to kind of shape these around and into this form, and I will layer them one by one. And the thought is, it's going to be complicated still, but the idea is to kind of have like a central core spiral and then individually shape each little segment to look very similar to a double helix. So that's the plan. We will see how that goes because I don't know. We'll see. Fabulous presentation. Anyway, none of that worked. However, I did realize something during my attempts to make that work, which was basically to just take string in addition to the vice grips in order to really tighten the strips around a piece of wood. The fact that I could use string to simply tighten up each of the strips in the first place probably should have occurred to me earlier, but it didn't. So anyway, this approach I realized was way too overcomplicated and probably wasn't going to look as good as I would prefer anyway. So I made a third jig and proceeded to try a much kind of a hybrid approach between the two that I've attempted so far. So I used the jig to then route out one half of the sword handle, and that half is made out of paddock, and then I take thin strips of cherry and purple heart, and then more cherry, and I layer those on top of the paddock half of the sword handle, or at least some of them. And then I take a purple heart piece and route it to the corresponding shape so that it'll fit in with the paddock. And then I basically just glue all of that together and squish them all into one, and then you have part of the sword handle ready to go. I still have to make the corresponding half of the double helix, but this half is done. I gave it a quick sanding just to make sure it would fit in the jig when I need it to, and then the next step was simply to begin cutting basically the other half of the handle which it would correspond with. Once I had that cut out, I began to put new strips on that side, which again would be cherry and then purple heart and then cherry. And once I had all the layers in place, then I could use a couple of clamps to make sure that it was nice and squished in there. So the handle is essentially together now, but clearly it is a little bit chonky and needs to be trimmed down. So if you are my friends or family, maybe avert your eyes as I put my fingers very close to this little saw here in order to trim it down. Now remember back to my first attempt to make the handle. I had two layers of paddock that was obviously a lot thicker. So I knew that there was going to be some issues with the actual thickness of the sword handle later on. So in order to address that, what I did in this case is I actually cut a piece of black walnut and then put that on the inner surface of both of the handle halves. So now the handle was nearly ready to actually go on the tang of the sword. However, I still wanted to make my own crossguard, because I haven't done that before. And I wanted to experiment with acid etching, because I did that once before, but I used the wrong stuff, and it made everything look gross. So that was my next plan. Off camera, I then cut out the center of the crossguard so it can fit onto the actual sword. Then I sanded down the surface, and I applied a Krylon spray paint to the entire crossguard. Then I waited for that to dry, and then what I had to do is basically just draw the pattern that I want on it using what essentially is like a really tiny kind of pointy chisel. It's really for jewelry. Anyway, so I did that and I carved off the paint basically in order to make a very flowery pattern. Then after that, I just put that in some acid, waited, and then cleaned it all off. With the crossguard clean, the happy little flowers looked cool, but they were kind of blending in with the rest of the crossguard. So I wanted to try and highlight them, and my first idea was to temper the entire crossguard. So I tossed it in the oven, gave it to a straw color, and that looked cool kind of on its own, but it wasn't helping a whole lot. So eventually I tried sanding it down, and there was a point where it actually looked pretty good. And then I sanded too much, because of course I did. Um, then I actually decided to do the other side of the crossguard and redo a whole new pattern. This time I tried to temper it blue, which did look cool, uh, but it also kind of ruined the earlier pattern in my process of making the new pattern. So, long story short, the crossguard is cool, looks okay, but it could be better. Going back to the handle, the next thing I needed to do was make yet another jig, take the two halves of the handle, route them out so there's a groove for the katana to actually fit into. Then I had to sand it down. Then I had to basically carve off the edges of the actual handle itself, smooth it all out, make it nice and round. And then it was finally time to assemble all the pieces together. Generally, it is advisable to make a design as modular as possible. You don't want it always to be like a solid brick that you can't take apart, because oftentimes, unexpectedly, things will go wrong with your project and you've got to repair it somehow. In this case, however, I decided to use a lot of JB Weld to assemble it, which obviously is not the traditional method, but that's okay. This is a stainless steel katana. It's not exactly an ancient relic. I did decide to go with a kind of hybrid system though, because traditionally a Japanese katana will have these pegs that go all the way through the tang and the handle. I decided that I would drill partway through the handle and then have the pegs in there, but then also secure it all with lots of wood glue and, again, more JB Weld. The handle went on quite nicely, just clamped it on there, let it dry for a bit, and it was solidly on there, so that's great. But it didn't quite look right still. There was still something lacking, and I wasn't entirely sure what at the time. And then I thought, what if I try and add some gold leaf to it and see how that looks? And so I initially used my actual, like, real gold leaf, and I wasted it all. Yep, I lost, I completely messed that up and wasted a bunch of gold. I instead decided to order some imitation gold leaf and try again, and this time I used the same or a very similar technique to what I did with the acid etching, and it turned out pretty okay. I quite like it. There was only one glorious step left, which was to put on a couple layers of polyurethane, and then it was finally done. Wait, hold on. Future me here. No, the sword was not done yet. The polyurethane, as it turns out, was not enough to prevent the gold leaf from getting all, like, scuffed up and dirty. So, what ended up happening, I didn't intend to record it, and so I didn't. So I don't have the footage of it happening. But in short, I took gold leaf and I redid the handle, and then I put epoxy over top of the handle so it would be much stronger, like a better protection. And then I also thought the crossguard, it doesn't look right. You can't see the flowers. It's too dark. So I also put gold leaf on that, which is the actual final product. Now it is actually done. Okay, on to a montage.